most of what goes on in sport goes on off the playing field.
It's about what you have on them in order to protect yourself.
I was first raped violently.
Well, you're finished. You'll never play football again.
Obviously, shoe contracts worth $400,000 or $500,000.
Morals and ethics don't exist above and beyond the society that they're a part of.
Nowadays, kids are faced with the choice of do you want a couple of $1 million or your college degree?
Sport is a metaphor for what goes on in the real world.
Few ethical and management issues in sport create more discussion than consideration of homosexuality in sports. Whether in youth sports, college, professional, or Olympic competition, consideration of the sexual practices of people seems to raise ethical issues for athletes, coaches, sports administrators, and fans. To what extent should the sexual orientation or preferences of people be a concern in sports? What are the personal and social values, important consequences, rights, and responsibilities that we should consider to ethically manage homosexuality in sports? These issues were discussed at the summit, the first international conference on ethics in sports. Let's visit the summit and consider some of the ethical and management issues related to homosexuality and sport.
My name is Pat Griffin. I teach at the University of Massachusetts in Amherst in the social justice education program. And my experience as a lesbian coach and athlete drives what I want to talk about with you today, because I was a very closeted lesbian coach and athlete both in high school and college. And I think one of the things that was a constant source of the many things that were a constant source of frustration in that experience for me was when people would talk about some of the assumptions that people made about lesbians and lesbians in sport. I kept thinking, who are they talking about? They're not talking about me. I don't even recognize myself in the kinds of things that they're saying about lesbians and the assumptions people are making about lesbians. And I think in a very deep way, it's my own experience as a coach and an athlete that drove me to want to explore that a little bit more and write about it in a way that would focus attention on that disjuncture between my experience and my experience of most other lesbian coaches and athletes that I know and the image of lesbian coaches and athletes that is out there. In the book I've written called Strong Women, Deep Closets, I refer to that as the lesbian boogie woman, and that all women in sport sort of live in the shadow of this lesbian boogie woman that scares everybody to death. And in that, the essence of the lesbian boogie woman identity, as far as I can see, is that the lesbian is assumed to be immoral and a sexual threat to all of the other women in sport. And that is sort of framed as the problem. The lesbian presence in sport is framed as a problem, or lesbian visibility, because I think there are some cases sort of like equivalent to the military don't ask, don't tell situation where lesbians are tolerated as long as they completely hide any evidence that they are lesbians from anybody else, even though people may know it. So it's a don't ask, don't tell essence, I think. And so there's that's how the problem has been defined. That has been the ethical issue as it's been defined around this issue in sport, is the presence of lesbians in sport is the problem. That is the moral or ethical problem.
I went to Notre Dame High School, and there I became the only three-sport athlete in our we had 1,200 boys at the time, and I was the only three-sport athlete. And again, I loved it, and I got more success, and it was like Bonnie Bear said the other night, the more success you got, the more you really wanted, the more you paid attention to it. And at that time, you know, I heard, and of course that was true too, of when I went on to win a scholarship and go to Marquette University and then University of Washington. And I wasn't going to give up. I heard statements that those faggots or pussies or sissies or perverts didn't belong in the sports. This is this was a very high ground area that those people didn't belong, and that didn't really relate to me because I was still just trying to do what I loved. I really loved it. It was really disgusting to me to hear those things, and and later on, of course, it bothered me so much that that's when I spoke out. I think I do a much better job of reacting to individual questions than I do in trying to give a full talk here. But I'm reminded too of what Martin Luther King said, that it's not about the content. Judge man by not the color of his skin, but the content of his character. And I would like to point out that I think that should be true also in terms of in dealing with sexual orientation. My sexual orientation, I think, has been a gift of nature. It's been a gift, and it's just like all gifts. I think we should celebrate and be happy in that gift. And I certainly wasn't happy many years ago, thinking that I had to live a life as a gay man. But I certainly am much happier and much more at peace with myself, living openly as a gay man and succeeding. Gay men and women have always been part of society and every facet of society. They've contributed an immense amount, and they should be treated as such. It's really kind of disgusting to me that there hasn't been more things done in terms of equaling leveling the playing field. It's being leveled in the sense of the laws that it was taken blacks 200 years to get some kind of equality, and it's how long has it taken for women? Well, the same thing. Sexual orientation. It seems like that's the only place in society that it's legally okay, and it's even permissible and even honored by some to discriminate and be hateful about. So some of the recent comments you've heard, these hateful statements, hate just begets hate.
When people do not want you to compete in a particular sport, they let you know very clearly that they don't want you. And one of the hardest hitting criticisms you can get from people are challenges to your gender, your identity as to who you are and who you've seen yourself as all your life. I started getting those challenges to my gender when I was 10 years old because my father taught me how to arm wrestle. And I was foolish enough to display that in elementary school level with the boys and beat them. And one of the other girls said to me, "You're a man." And I was blown away at 10. I thought, this was my first experience of it.
Well, in seeking me out, Glenn Burke, who's passed away with AIDS, sought me out. There has been a number of other athletes who have called and who I've run into by chance and who have shared something private with me that they've never shared with anybody. A couple of them have, and I'm talking about really incredibly respected players on their teams, captains of their teams. But they shared their bisexual self that they've never even experienced because their life would get too confusing for them. College athletes have sought me out, but not overall. I think they're probably afraid that I possibly could identify them. I'm not quite sure. But I think what's happened today with all the dialogue about gays and period in society, lesbians. I think it's increased the size of the closet, and it's made it a little bit more comfortable for them to stay in the closet, as we were talking about before. And so they don't quite feel the need. I was suffocating. I was strangling. It wasn't a courageous act. It was, I wanted to live. I wanted to be happy. I knew I could be happy.
Yesterday, someone asked me what panel I was moderating here. This is a guy who used to play in the National Football League. I happened to be talking to him, and I told him, and he goes, "Who's on the panel?" And Dave Copay. Do you know Dave Copay? He goes, "I was a rookie with San Francisco when Dave was there, and the guys played a joke on me. I needed a car, and they sent me to where Dave was working." "Were you selling cars?" Or he goes, "They sent me to where Dave was working because I didn't know that he was gay, and then when I came back and they said, 'Did you get a car from Dave?' And they said, yeah, and they told me about him. This was yesterday. This was yesterday. And they said they told me about Dave, and, you know, I felt really funny about it. I said, you bought a car from a gay guy. What's the big deal? But this is the mentality. This is the mentality that exists. Now, this may have happened in mid-'70s, but this is a discussion I had with somebody yesterday. And this is how just the mere mention of Dave Kopay to many people in the National Football League, it's as though he is the devil incarnate. And maybe he is just such a threat to them, but I know this for a fact because I, in my capacity as a journalist, have spoken to a number of players, and Dave and I have talked about that.
Well, I'd like to. I'm sorry to hear that, but and I have run into players directly, and they have shared other things of themselves, and I'm talking about heterosexual players, married with families, who just blew me away the fact that they read the David Kopay story and were proud of what I had done in it. Howie Long, for example, is a case, an incredible, I think, guy and talent and secure within himself, and I mean, there's a whole lot.
The experience and concerns of gay and lesbian people in sports may differ in many respects from their heterosexual associates, but most athletes are very much alike in their efforts and desire to win and their enjoyment of the sport.
David Kopay loves sports and competition. For 10 years, he played football in the NFL as a running back. In an honest 1975 Washington, D.C. interview, he publicly came out of the closet. The interview ended his football career. He heard people say in high school, college, and professional sports that gays did not belong. After coming out of the closet, he says he is happier and at peace living honestly and openly. Dave notes that gay people have always been a part of society, so it seems that in our society, the majority of gay people feel most comfortable staying in the closet. Andrea Kramer, an ESPN sports correspondent, believes that, based on her discussions with other athletes in the NFL, David Kopay is seen as a threat to other players. Dr. Pat Griffin argues that the lesbian stereotype is false, and there is a big difference between her personal experience as a lesbian and the widely disseminated image of lesbians. She believes that the presence of lesbians in sport has been presented as the problem rather than the treatment of lesbians in sport. Dr. Angela Schneider argues that our identity comes from who we believe we are deep inside us, and that being shunned by others hurts, as she was hurt when at age 10, she was accused by other girls of being a man.
So how do and how should professional teams, colleges, and youth leagues deal with issues of homosexuality in sport? What are some of the management-specific issues that relate to homosexuality and the lives of athletes, coaches, and sport administrators?
I think what's going on is that sport is based on an ideal of what an ideal athlete is. And if you look at the ideal woman, the ideal man, and the ideal athlete, the characteristics of the ideal man and the ideal athlete fit. But the characteristics of the ideal woman are totally opposite to the ideal athlete. And this is the Amazon. The Amazon is the anathema to what the ideal woman is: softness, grace, and childbearing, and focused on those sorts of things. And I think women are in a double bind in sport, because they're damned if they do and they're damned if they don't. Because if they take on what we did with the pink shirts, and it was not totally unintentional, try and maintain the feminine, then they're lesser athletes because they're not being taken seriously. And then if they try to take on the masculine, they're the Amazon. So they lose, and it's a very difficult situation to be in. It means that you are constantly in the negative.
Reggie White is one of the greatest defensive players of our generation, named to the 75th anniversary team. He is a very, he's an activist. He's a very religious man. He was invited to speak. He's with the Green Bay Packers. He was invited to speak in front of the Wisconsin State Legislature. He I'm giving you sort of a Reader's Digest version here. He turned it into sort of a personal diatribe on his stereotypes of Hispanics, Asian Americans, whites, Jews, and capped it off by basically blasting homosexuals, going beyond it's a sin in the Bible, and really doing a tremendous amount of damage to his reputation. And I know Reggie very, very well. I've covered him since he was in the USFL many, many years ago. And this was absolutely the low point of his career in terms of a public image.
Basically, he's, I think, a well-meaning person, but the things he's been saying is so dangerous. It's unbelievable. It causes kids to get the right to go out and bash youngsters, to go out and bash and kill people. I mean, it's really, really dangerous, and he should be called on it.
People in a culture who have privilege, like white people and heterosexual people and men or Christian people, you have the luxury, the privilege of being able to think of yourself as an individual, and more so than if you're a member of a targeted group in a culture. And so that if a lesbian comes out, then she automatically becomes a representative of a group. If I speak, then there's always a danger of people assuming that all lesbians are like me and that I'm speaking for lesbians. I'm not just an individual. I'm a lesbian. I have this whole people all behind me sort of like channeling through me or something. I don't know.
And really, your sexuality.
A heterosexual person on a panel is just a person. And so I think that's one of the real differences in how group characteristics get used against people.
But on a sexual orientation issue, for years I was the avowed homosexual. Or you'd see, in terms of anything about sexual orientation, you'd see the total drag queen or the total dyke on bike, and I'm glad they're there, But that's what you would see. So and they made it very easy to stereotype, and I don't know.
Can I say?
And what I believe should happen is that we need to completely redefine the problem, so that the focus is not on lesbians as a problem, but the ethical issue is on the discrimination and harassment of lesbians based on a stereotype, the lesbian boogie woman image, assumptions that people make about lesbians in sport. And even a lot of the discussions that we hear today, because I think there is a lot more discussion about homophobia in sport, as it often gets framed. It gets framed as an issue of concern for straight women in sport. How does homophobia prevent straight women from feeling welcomed into sport, rather than talking about the blatant, in many cases, discrimination and harassment of lesbian coaches and athletes. And lesbian coach and athletes are, I tried to think of a way to sort of frame some of the issues, and I came up with an equation, which is interesting for me because math was never my strong suit. But it's a word equation. To me, it seems like it's double lives plus double standards plus double crosses equals double trouble for lesbian athletes and coaches. So let me just say a little bit about what I mean about that. I think, first of all, most lesbian coaches live double lives in sport. And they choose, as I did when I was coaching and when I was an athlete, to completely hide their identities as much as possible from discovery. Hiding relationships, hiding any kind of discussion about personal life, completely separating personal life from their coaching life. And people say, well, this it's a private issue. What difference does that make? Well, I would challenge any heterosexual person here in the audience to spend a day even trying to never let anyone know who you are. And I think you would have a little glimpse of the tension involved in that kind of pressure of trying to lead a double life. It also has all kinds of ramifications on relationships, the authenticity of relationships that we have in our professional relationships. And it makes us vulnerable. Oddly enough, I think that closeted lesbian coaches in many ways are almost more vulnerable to discrimination and harassment than coaches who come out. And people who believe that the closet is secure only need to know that most lesbian and coaches who are fired or athletes who are dismissed from teams were not out. They were very closeted. So I think that assumption that the silence and being closeted is protection is false, because the closet is really made of glass. And there's this weird social contract, I think, that has been made where lesbian presence is sometimes tolerated in sport as long as they remain invisible. So the access to sport is contingent on invisibility and silence. And because that tolerance is tenuous and conditional, it can be taken away at any time. The second, so that's the double life issue. The double standards issue has to do with the fact that I think there really are, if you look at how sexual harassment is handled, particularly male sexual harassment of females in sport, whether it's coaches or athletes, there's a very different standard in how that is treated, or any accusation of sexual harassment against a lesbian coach. The lesbian coach is almost always assumed to be guilty by very definition, because she's a lesbian coach and she's assumed to be a sexual threat that has to be sort of reined in. She's almost automatically assumed to be guilty. And that's not necessarily the case with a male athlete or coach who is accused of sexual harassment. It's also assumed that lesbian coaches are a threat to their female athletes in terms of getting into relationships, sexual relationships with them. And so that, again, there's a real double standard there. There's a double standard in terms of, throughout the last couple of days, we've heard a lot about male athletes' rude, lewd, illegal behavior being tolerated. And yet a lesbian coach can have completely exemplary behavior on and off the playing field. And if someone decides that because she's a lesbian, she's not fit, then she can be relieved of her position or dismissed from the team. So there's that double standard. Another way that double standard works is a lesbian coach can be a winning coach. And that, for male coaches, that is often an inoculation against being dismissed for some kind of rude or illegal behavior. If you're winning, then that other behavior will be tolerated. That doesn't hold true for lesbian coaches. Even when a lesbian coach is a winning coach, she still sometimes can lose her job. In terms of the double cross, the way I frame that is that because of the silence around this whole issue and the lack of understanding and the lack of opportunity for education around this issue, there's a lot of fear and prejudice at play within teams, particularly at the college level, I think. And so you have a lot of internalized homophobia among closeted lesbian athletes at work. You have fear on the part of heterosexual athletes, and there's an incredible opportunity there for a lot of accusations, misperceptions that can be blown out of proportion really fast and can cost a coach her career, or an athlete her place on the team. And so in a sense, there's a lot of double cross even within the sport itself, in terms of, and I think that a lot of that comes because of the pervasive misunderstanding and fear around these issues. And in the end, that leads to double trouble, because there are only 10 states in the United States where lesbian and gay people have civil rights protection, and that puts coaches in a pretty vulnerable position, even if they want to bring a suit and want to become public, which is the other issue. If a lesbian coach makes her identity public in order to challenge discrimination, then there's the question of will anybody else hire her. And so just to close my little opening statement, I think the issue for me is how can we change the focus in the moral issues around this on the presence or the visibility of lesbians in sport to where is the moral responsibility for sport governing bodies, individual colleges and universities, coaches associations, and individual athletic directors and coaches and other athletes for addressing the real issue of discrimination and harassment of lesbian athletes.
The ethical environment can be influenced by stereotypes, and management problems can be created when stakeholders hold on to stereotypes as standards. Dr. Schneider believes that stereotypes of the ideal woman and the ideal athlete are in conflict, that women athletes are judged negatively as athletes when they are feminine, and negatively as women when they are athletic. Andrea Kramer reports that gay and lesbian people are vilified by high-profile anti-homosexual voices, such as Reggie White's speech that went way beyond a personal moral judgment characterizing homosexuality as a sin in the Bible. David Cope believes that hate speech is dangerous because some people use such hate speech as cultural permission to bash and kill gays. Dr. Pat Griffin argues that lesbians are not the problem. Rather, discrimination and harassment of lesbians is the problem. The image of the lesbian boogie woman is a stereotype which some have used to justify treating lesbians as the management problem. Dr. Griffin claims that some sports managers use double standards, one standard for heterosexuals and another for lesbians. The double standards are management realities to some, which help to convince lesbians to stay in the closet and lead a double life. Because being identified as a gay or lesbian can result in serious problems for athletes, coaches, and other sports management personnel.
Sexual orientation can be a private issue, but when scholarships, opportunities for employment and advancement, or chances to participate in sports are limited or reduced because of it, one's sexual orientation then becomes a matter of social, legal, and ethical concern. Sports was out front and led society toward the acceptance of racial integration. Sexual orientation is another societal issue in which sports may play a significant role, at least in focusing attention on this area of social change.